Robert Castellano stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his small apartment, straightening his tie for the 10th time. Today was the day he would announce his run for city council. His hands shook slightly as he thought about the speech he had practiced for weeks. At 32 years old, Robert had never imagined he would enter politics, but the problems in his neighborhood had pushed him to act. Robert grew up on Maple Street, where most families struggled to pay their bills. His father worked 2 jobs at the factory and still could not afford to fix their leaking roof. His mother cleaned offices at night to help make ends meet. Robert remembered going to bed hungry some nights because there was not enough food for everyone. These memories stayed with him even after he became a successful insurance salesman. The idea to run for office came to Robert during a neighborhood meeting about the broken streetlights on his block. For months, residents had called the city asking for repairs, but nothing happened. Crime had increased because the dark streets made it easy for thieves to hide. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly woman who lived alone, was too scared to leave her house after sunset. "Someone needs to do something," Robert had said at that meeting. "We pay our taxes. We deserve better." An older man named Frank Martinez stood up and pointed at Robert. "Then why don't you do something about it?" "You talk well. You understand our problems. Run for city council." The room fell silent. Everyone looked at Robert. He felt his face turn red, but something inside him stirred. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe he could make a difference. Robert spent the next 3 months learning about local politics. He discovered that the current city council members rarely visited neighborhoods like his. They lived in expensive houses across town and seemed to care more about big business deals than fixing streetlights or filling potholes. He also learned that running for office required money he did not have. Campaign signs, flyers, and advertisements all cost hundreds of dollars. Robert worked extra hours selling insurance and saved every penny. His girlfriend, Linda, helped by designing simple flyers on her computer. His neighbors volunteered to put up signs and knock on doors. Robert's campaign message was simple: a voice for working families. He promised to focus on basic services that people needed every day: better police patrols, fixed roads, working streetlights, clean parks where children could play safely. He did not make fancy promises about big projects or economic development. He talked about problems that kept people awake at night. The other candidates laughed at Robert behind his back. They called him naive and inexperienced. One opponent, a businessman named Charles Wright, spent 10 times more money on his campaign. Wright had support from the local newspaper and endorsements from important people in the city. But Robert had something his opponents did not have. He had authenticity. When he knocked on doors and talked to voters, they could see that he genuinely cared about their problems. He listened carefully when people complained about their broken sidewalks or their fear of walking alone at night. He wrote down their concerns in a small notebook and promised to remember them. One evening, Robert was campaigning in the Riverside neighborhood when he met an old woman named Elena Vasquez. She invited him into her kitchen for coffee and told him about her grandson, Miguel, who had been shot in a drive-by shooting 6 months earlier. Miguel survived, but he was paralyzed from the waist down. "The police said they would investigate," Elena said, tears in her eyes, "but they never came back. They don't care about people like us." Robert felt anger rise in his chest. This was exactly the kind of injustice he wanted to fight. He promised Elena that if he won, he would personally make sure the police followed up on Miguel's case. As election day approached, Robert felt nervous but hopeful. The polls showed him in second place, behind Charles Wright but ahead of the other candidates. His supporters worked hard, making phone calls and driving elderly voters to polling stations. On election night, Robert gathered with his volunteers at a small restaurant owned by one of his supporters. As the results came in, the room grew quiet with excitement. Robert was winning by a small margin. When the final votes were counted, he had defeated Charles Wright by just 847 votes. The room exploded with cheers. People hugged Robert and slapped him on the back. Linda kissed him and whispered, "You did it, baby. You really did it." Robert felt overwhelmed with emotion. These people had believed in him when no one else would. They had trusted him with their hopes for a better future. He promised himself that he would never let them down. In his victory speech that night, Robert thanked his supporters and made a simple promise: "I will never forget where I came from or who sent me here. This victory belongs to all of us, and I will work every day to earn your trust." Over the next 4 years on the city council, Robert kept his promises. He fought for better street lighting and got the broken lights on Maple Street fixed within his first month in office. He pushed for increased police patrols in high-crime neighborhoods and personally followed up on Miguel Vasquez's case until the shooters were caught. Robert also discovered he had a talent for bringing people together. He organized town halls where residents could speak directly to city officials. He created committees that included ordinary citizens, not just business leaders and wealthy donors. Other council members began to respect his opinions, even when they disagreed with him. But Robert's biggest success was his work on the city budget. He studied every line item and found millions of dollars being wasted on unnecessary projects. He redirected that money toward basic services like road repairs, park maintenance, and after-school programs for children. The local newspaper, which had endorsed his opponent 4 years earlier, now praised Robert's practical approach to governing. Editorial writers called him a breath of fresh air and exactly what city government needs. By the time Robert decided to run for mayor, he had become one of the most popular politicians in the city. His supporters included not just working-class families, but also business owners who respected his honesty and effectiveness. Even some wealthy donors began contributing to his campaigns, impressed by his ability to get things done. Robert won the mayor's race by the largest margin in the city's history. On Inauguration Day, as he stood on the steps of City Hall taking the oath of office, he looked out at the crowd and saw Elena Vasquez sitting in the front row. She was smiling and holding a picture of her grandson Miguel, who was now in college on a scholarship Robert had helped him obtain. At that moment, Robert felt like the luckiest man in the world. He had the trust of the people, the power to make real change and a bright future ahead of him. He had no idea that this peak of success would soon become the beginning of his downfall. 3 years into his time as mayor, Robert Castellano sat in his office staring at budget reports that made his stomach hurt. The numbers were bad, worse than he had expected when he took office. The city was running out of money and tough decisions had to be made soon. The previous mayor had hidden many financial problems from the public. Old debts were coming due, and the state was demanding payment on loans that had been delayed for years. The police department needed new equipment. The fire stations required major repairs. Schools were falling apart, and parents were complaining loudly at every city meeting. Robert had always prided himself on being honest with the people who elected him. But now he faced a choice that kept him awake at night. He could either cut popular programs that helped families, or he could find new ways to bring money into the city. Neither option felt good. The after-school program that kept kids safe while their parents worked would have to close. The senior citizen meal delivery service would end. The free clinic that provided basic health care to poor families would lose its funding. Robert had fought hard to create these programs, and now he might have to destroy them. His assistant, Maria Santos, brought him coffee and sat down across from his desk. Maria had worked for the city for 15 years and understood its problems better than most people. She had supported Robert since his city council days and had become one of his most trusted advisors. "The phone has been ringing all morning," Maria said. "People are hearing rumors about the budget cuts. Mrs. Patterson called crying about the senior meal program. She says her neighbors depend on those meals to survive." Robert rubbed his forehead. These were the people who had trusted him, who had voted for him because they believed he would protect them. Now he felt like he was betraying everything he had promised. "There has to be another way," Robert said. "We just need more revenue. More businesses, more jobs, more tax money coming in." Maria nodded. "Actually, there might be an opportunity. Vincent Torres wants to meet with you this afternoon. He says he has a proposal that could help the city's finances." Robert knew who Vincent Torres was. Everyone in the city knew Torres Construction. His company had built half the office buildings downtown and many of the new houses in the expensive neighborhoods. Torres was rich, powerful, and had connections with politicians across the state. Torres arrived at City Hall that afternoon wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. He was a large man with gray hair and a confident smile that made Robert feel slightly uncomfortable. They shook hands and Torres sat down without waiting to be invited. "Mr. Mayor, I hear you have some budget problems," Torres said, getting straight to the point. "I think I can help you solve them." Robert leaned forward, interested despite his caution. "I'm listening." Torres opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder full of papers. I want to build a new shopping center on the east side of town. Not just any shopping center, but something special. High-end stores, restaurants, maybe even a small hotel. It would create hundreds of jobs and bring in millions in tax revenue. The idea sounded good, but Robert sensed there was more to it. What do you need from the city? Torres smiled wider. Just a few small favors. The land I want to use is currently zoned for single-family homes. I need that changed to commercial zoning, and I'd like to get the construction contract without having to bid against other companies. You know how slow the bidding process can be. Robert felt warning bells going off in his head. City law required all major contracts to go through a public bidding process. This gave every company a fair chance to compete and usually saved the city money. What Torres was asking for was not illegal, but it went against everything Robert believed about fair and transparent government. I don't know, Robert said slowly. The bidding process exists for good reasons. It protects taxpayers and ensures we get the best deal. Torres leaned back in his chair and his smile faded slightly. Let me be more direct, Mr. Mayor. This project will bring in at least $3 million in tax revenue over the next 5 years. That's enough to fund all your social programs and still have money left over for infrastructure improvements. Robert's heart started beating faster. $3 million would solve all his budget problems. He could keep the after-school program open. The seniors would still get their meals. The free clinic could expand its services. He would not have to disappoint the people who trusted him. Plus, Torres continued, my company would be willing to make a generous donation to your re-election campaign, say $50,000. I believe in supporting politicians who understand how to work with the business community. Now Robert felt truly uncomfortable. The offer sounded too much like a bribe, even if Torres was careful not to call it that. Robert had seen other politicians get into trouble for accepting money from contractors who later received city business. But $50,000 would help him win re-election easily. And if he lost the next election, all his programs would probably be cut anyway by whoever replaced him. Maybe it was better to make this one compromise in order to protect everything else he had built. Robert asked Torres to give him time to think about the proposal. After Torres left, Robert sat alone in his office as the sun set outside his window. The building grew quiet as city workers went home to their families. He thought about Elena Vasquez and her grandson Miguel. He thought about Mrs. Patterson and the other seniors who needed meal delivery. He thought about the children who would have nowhere safe to go after school if the programs were cut. Then he thought about his own family. Linda was pregnant with their first child, and they had been talking about buying a house in a better neighborhood. The mayor's salary was decent, but not enough to afford the kind of life they wanted for their future children. Robert called Maria at home and asked her to schedule another meeting with Torres for the next day. When Maria asked if everything was okay, Robert said he was just exploring all options to save the city's programs. The next morning, Torres returned to City Hall with the same confident smile. This time, Robert had made his decision. I can approve the zoning change, Robert said carefully, and I think we can arrange for your company to get the construction contract without a full bidding process. But I want to be clear about something. This is a one-time exception because of our budget crisis, and your company better deliver everything you promised. Torres reached across the desk to shake Robert's hand. You won't regret this decision, Mr. Mayor. This is the beginning of a great partnership. As Robert shook Torres's hand, he told himself he was doing the right thing. The city needed the money and people needed their programs. Sometimes leaders had to make difficult choices that others might not understand. But deep down, Robert knew he had just crossed a line he had never intended to cross. He had compromised his principles for money, even if he justified it as helping others. The worst part was how easy it had been. Over the next few weeks, Robert pushed the zoning change through the city council. He presented it as an economic development opportunity that would create jobs and generate tax revenue. He did not mention his private meetings with Torres or the campaign donation that would soon follow. The council approved the zoning change by a narrow margin. Some members asked tough questions about why the normal bidding process was being skipped, but Robert assured them it was necessary to move quickly on such an important project. When the $50,000 donation arrived at Robert's campaign office, he felt a mixture of relief and guilt. The money would help him win re-election and continue protecting the programs people depended on. But he also knew he had accepted payment for official favors. something he had always criticized other politicians for doing. Robert told himself this was different. He was not stealing money for personal gain. He was finding creative solutions to help his community. But as he signed the papers authorizing Torres's construction contract, Robert could not shake the feeling that he had just made a deal with the devil. What Robert did not realize was that Vincent Torres had been recording their conversations from the very beginning. Torres had learned long ago that having evidence of politicians' compromises was the best way to ensure their continued cooperation. The shopping center project moved forward quickly, and the tax revenue began flowing into the city budget, just as Torres had promised. Robert was able to save all the social programs and even expand some of them. Newspaper editorials praised his creative leadership during the budget crisis. But Torres was already planning his next request, and Robert would soon discover that some doors once opened could never be closed again. 6 months after the shopping center deal, Vincent Torres called Robert with another proposal. This time, Torres wanted to build luxury condominiums near the waterfront. The project would require the city to sell him public land at a reduced price and provide tax breaks for the first 5 years. Robert hesitated at first. The waterfront park was popular with families, and selling part of it to developers would upset many residents. But Torres reminded Robert of how successful their first partnership had been. The shopping center was bringing in exactly the tax revenue Torres had promised, and Robert's approval ratings were higher than ever. "Think about it, Mr. Mayor," Torres said during their private meeting. "This project will create even more jobs and bring wealthy residents to the city. Rich people pay high taxes and spend money at local businesses. Everyone wins." Torres also mentioned that he was prepared to make another campaign contribution, this time for $75,000. The money would help Robert build a strong war chest for his re-election campaign, which was still 2 years away. Robert found himself saying yes before he had time to think carefully about the decision. The process was becoming easier each time. He told himself he was just being practical and helping the city grow, but this deal was different from the first one. To make room for the condominiums, Robert had to convince the city council to sell part of the waterfront park to Torres Construction. This required him to mislead the council about the true value of the land and the benefits of the project. Robert hired an appraiser who was recommended by Torres. The appraiser valued the waterfront property at much less than it was actually worth. Robert presented this low appraisal to the council as evidence that selling the land was a good deal for the city. Several council members questioned the low valuation, but Robert assured them that the appraisal was accurate and that the tax revenue from the condominiums would more than make up for any loss on the land sale. The council approved the sale by 1 vote. Robert felt relief mixed with guilt as he signed the papers transferring public land to Torres Construction for far less than its real value. Around this time, Robert began to notice changes in his own behavior and desires. The campaign contributions from Torres had given him a taste of having more money than usual. Robert found himself wanting things he had never cared about before. He started shopping at expensive stores and eating at fancy restaurants. He bought a new car, telling Linda it was important for the mayor to look successful. When Linda questioned the cost, Robert assured her that his salary could afford it, even though he was secretly using campaign funds to pay for some of his new lifestyle. Robert also began spending time with wealthy business people who had never paid attention to him before. They invited him to exclusive parties and golf tournaments. These new friends made Robert feel important and sophisticated, very different from the working-class neighborhood where he grew up. The more time Robert spent with rich people, the more he began to see things from their perspective. They complained about high taxes and government regulations that limited their business profits. They argued that successful business people like themselves created jobs and deserved special consideration from city government. Robert found himself agreeing with these arguments. He began to think that his old focus on helping poor families was too narrow. Maybe the best way to help everyone was to help businesses succeed first, then let the benefits trickle down to ordinary people. This new philosophy made it easier for Robert to justify his next compromise. A group of developers wanted to build a casino on the edge of town. The project would require changing zoning laws and would need special permits that normally took years to obtain. The developers offered Robert a consulting fee of $100,000, paid to a company they would help him set up. The money would not go directly to his campaign, so it would not have to be reported to election officials. Robert could use it however he wanted. Robert had always opposed gambling, believing it hurt poor families who could not afford to lose money. But the developers convinced him that the casino would create thousands of jobs and bring tourists to the city. They also pointed out that if their casino was not built, people would just drive to other cities to gamble, so the city might as well benefit from the tax revenue. To receive the consulting fee without attracting attention, Robert needed to set up a business that looked legitimate. Maria Santos helped him create a company called Municipal Consulting Services that supposedly provided advice to other cities about economic development. The company existed only on paper, but it gave Robert a way to receive money from developers and other business people who wanted favorable treatment from the city government. Robert told himself this was not really corruption because he was providing valuable advice and expertise. Setting up the fake company required Robert to lie on official documents and hide the true source of his income from tax authorities. Each lie made the next one easier to tell. Robert discovered he had a talent for creating believable explanations for things that would look suspicious to outsiders. The casino project moved through the approval process faster than any similar project in the city's history. Robert used his influence to pressure reluctant council members and city staff to support the proposal. When neighborhood groups organized to oppose the casino, Robert made sure their concerns were ignored at public hearings. The $100,000 payment arrived in Robert's consulting company account just days after the casino permits were approved. Robert felt a rush of excitement as he saw the money in his bank account. It was more cash than he had ever possessed at one time. Robert used part of the money to buy Linda an expensive diamond necklace for her birthday. When she asked how he could afford such an extravagant gift, Robert told her that his consulting business was doing well. The lie came out of his mouth so smoothly that he almost believed it himself, but the money was addictive. Having a large bank account made Robert feel secure and powerful in ways he had never experienced. He began looking for more opportunities to earn consulting fees from businesses that needed help navigating city government. Robert's lifestyle changed dramatically over the next year. He moved his family to a mansion in the most expensive neighborhood in the city. He bought a boat and joined an exclusive country club. He hired a personal trainer and started wearing custom-made suits. When reporters asked about his apparent wealth, Robert explained that his consulting business and wise investments had been very successful. He pointed out that there was nothing wrong with a public official earning money from private business activities, as long as there were no conflicts of interest. Of course, there were massive conflicts of interest, but Robert had become skilled at hiding them. He created a network of shell companies and offshore bank accounts that made it difficult to trace the money back to the businesses that were paying him. Robert also began using his position to help friends and political allies get city contracts and jobs. In exchange, they provided him with kickbacks and favors that further increased his wealth and influence. The transformation was complete when Robert hired a public relations firm to improve his image and help him consider running for higher office. The firm was owned by associates of Vincent Torres, and their fees were paid through Robert's consulting company. Robert now saw himself as a successful businessman who happened to hold public office. Rather than a public servant who was supposed to work for the people who elected him, he had convinced himself that his personal success was good for the city because it proved that local government could work effectively with the business community. But Robert's greed was becoming harder to hide. City employees began to notice that major contracts were being awarded to the same companies over and over again. Neighborhood activists complained that their concerns were being ignored while wealthy developers got whatever they wanted. Some council members started asking uncomfortable questions about why so many decisions seemed to benefit the same group of business people. A few city workers tried to raise concerns about irregularities. In the bidding process for public contracts, Robert dealt with these problems by promoting loyal employees and transferring troublesome ones to less important positions. He also began hiring consultants and contractors who owed their jobs to him and could be counted on to support his agenda. The city government was slowly being transformed into a machine designed to benefit Robert and his business partners. Public resources were being redirected to private profits. and anyone who objected was pushed aside or intimidated into silence. Robert told himself that all politicians had to work within an imperfect system, and at least he was getting things done. The city was growing and attracting new businesses. Employment was up, and the downtown area was being revitalized. But the benefits were flowing mainly to wealthy people who could afford the new luxury developments and expensive restaurants. Working-class families were being pushed out of their neighborhoods by rising rents and property taxes. The programs that had once helped poor families were being quietly reduced to fund tax breaks for developers. By his 5th year as mayor, Robert Castellano had built a complex network of corruption that touched every part of city government. What had started as a single compromise with Vincent Torres had grown into a systematic operation involving dozens of people and millions of dollars. Robert could no longer manage all the schemes by himself. He needed trusted allies who could help him coordinate the various deals and keep track of the money flowing through his shell companies. Maria Santos had become his most important partner in this criminal enterprise. Maria had watched Robert's transformation with growing unease, but she also found herself benefiting from his success. Robert gave her substantial raises and bonuses that were far more than other city employees received. He also helped her brother get a high-paying job with one of the construction companies that worked for the city. When Robert asked Maria to help him with increasingly questionable activities, she found it hard to say no. She told herself that she was just doing her job and following orders from her boss. Besides, the extra money helped her support her elderly parents and pay for her daughter's college education. Maria's main job was to manage the paperwork that made Robert's corrupt deals look legitimate. When contractors paid bribes disguised as consulting fees, Maria created fake invoices and work records to justify the payments. When Robert wanted to steer a contract to a particular company, Maria made sure the bidding process was rigged to produce the desired outcome. The city treasurer, David Park, was another key member of Robert's team. David had been struggling with gambling debts when Robert offered to help him out in exchange for some small favors. At first, David just delayed certain audits or overlooked minor irregularities in expense reports. But as Robert's operation grew larger, David's role became more important. He helped create the shell companies that Robert used to hide his bribes and kickbacks. He also manipulated the city's financial records to conceal how much money was being diverted from public projects to private pockets. David was good with numbers and understood how to make complicated financial transactions look normal to outside observers. He created fake budgets and misleading reports that hid the true cost of Robert's deals with developers and contractors. The three of them met regularly in Robert's office after normal business hours to coordinate their activities. They developed code words and secret signals to communicate about sensitive matters when other people might be listening. Robert's office was swept for electronic bugs every month by a security company owned by one of Torres's associates. Their biggest challenge was dealing with city employees who asked too many questions or seemed suspicious about what was happening. Some workers noticed that the same companies kept winning city contracts, even when their bids were not the lowest. Others observed that certain projects seemed to get approved much faster than normal. Robert's solution was to create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation that discouraged people from speaking up. Employees who raised concerns found themselves transferred to less desirable jobs or passed over for promotions. Their work was criticized harshly, and they were made to feel like troublemakers who were not team players. Robert also rewarded loyalty generously. Workers who kept quiet about what they saw received raises, bonuses, and better assignments. Their family members were sometimes hired for city jobs, even when they were not particularly qualified. The message was clear. Those who supported Robert would be taken care of, while those who opposed him would suffer. One of Robert's most effective tactics was to recruit city employees into his corrupt network by making them complicit in small violations at first. An accounting clerk might be asked to process a questionable expense report. A building inspector might be encouraged to overlook minor code violations for a friendly contractor. Once these employees had bent the rules even slightly, Robert had power over them. He could threaten to expose their past mistakes if they ever tried to oppose him. This strategy gradually expanded the circle of people who were either actively participating in corruption or too compromised to speak out against it. The city's legal department was also brought under Robert's control. The chief city attorney, Patricia Wells, was replaced with a lawyer named Stephen Black, who had previously worked for Vincent Torres's company. Black's job was to find legal justifications for Robert's questionable decisions and to intimidate anyone who threatened to expose the corruption. When citizen groups filed lawsuits challenging Robert's deals with developers, Black used aggressive tactics to defeat them. He buried opponents in paperwork, filed frivolous motions to delay proceedings, and hired expensive outside law firms to overwhelm community organizations that could not afford prolonged legal battles. Black also worked closely with the city's public relations department to control information that reached the media and the public. Press releases were carefully crafted to present Robert's activities in the most favorable light possible. Negative information was suppressed or spun to minimize its impact. The local newspaper had been supportive of Robert since his early days as mayor, but some reporters began asking uncomfortable questions about his sudden wealth and the unusual number of no-bid contracts being awarded to the same group of companies. Robert dealt with this problem by developing close relationships with the newspaper's publishers and editors. He provided them with exclusive access to information about major city projects and invited them to expensive social events where they mingled with influential business leaders. When these friendly approaches were not enough, Robert was prepared to use harder tactics. He quietly gathered information about the personal lives of critical reporters and editors, looking for embarrassing details that could be used to discredit them if necessary. One investigative reporter, Sarah Chen, had been particularly persistent in asking questions about city contracts and Robert's finances. Robert instructed his staff to monitor Chen's activities and limit her access to public records by claiming that her requests were too broad or would interfere with ongoing city business. When Chen continued to investigate despite these obstacles, Robert arranged for her editor to be offered a lucrative job with a public relations firm that worked for several of his business partners. The editor took the job and was replaced with someone who was less interested in investigative journalism. Chen found herself reassigned to cover less important stories about community events and school board meetings. Her requests for information about city finances were repeatedly denied or delayed. Eventually, she became frustrated and left the newspaper to work for a magazine in another city. With the media threat neutralized, Robert felt more confident about expanding his corrupt activities. He began accepting larger bribes and steering more public money to his private business interests. The line between his role as mayor and his role as a businessman had completely disappeared. Robert also started using city resources for personal purposes. He had city workers perform maintenance on his house and boat. He used the city's legal department to handle his private business affairs. He even had the police provide security for private parties at his home. These abuses required the cooperation of dozens of city employees, but Robert's system of rewards and punishments had created a culture where few people dared to complain. Those who benefited from the corruption had strong incentives to keep quiet, while those who opposed it felt powerless to do anything about it. The few employees who tried to report wrongdoing through official channels found their complaints buried in bureaucratic procedures or dismissed as misunderstandings. The city's ethics hotline was managed by people who reported directly to Robert, so complaints rarely led to serious investigations. Robert had also cultivated relationships with state and federal officials who might otherwise investigate local corruption. He made campaign contributions to influential politicians and hired their friends and relatives for well-paid consulting jobs. These relationships provided him with advance warning of any investigations that might threaten his operation. By this point, Robert's corrupt network had become so large and complex that it would have been difficult to dismantle, even if someone had wanted to do so. Too many people were involved and too much money was at stake. The system had developed a momentum of its own that carried everyone along. Robert felt untouchable. He had successfully intimidated his opponents, corrupted the oversight systems that were supposed to monitor his behavior, and surrounded himself with loyal allies who depended on his continued success for their own prosperity. But Robert had made a critical mistake. In his arrogance and greed, he had failed to notice that some people were quietly documenting his crimes and waiting for the right moment to expose them. The very system of fear and intimidation that protected him had also created enemies who were determined to see him brought down. The web of deceit that Robert had so carefully constructed was about to become a trap that would destroy him and everyone who had helped him betray the public trust. James Rodriguez had worked for the city's maintenance department for 12 years. He fixed broken water pipes, repaired streetlights, and maintained the equipment that kept the city running smoothly. James took pride in his work and believed in serving the public. Even though his job did not pay very much, James first noticed something strange when he was asked to deliver expensive construction equipment to addresses that did not match the work orders in his computer system. The invoices said the equipment was going to city construction sites, but James was told to take it to private warehouses and residential addresses instead. When James asked his supervisor about the discrepancy, he was told not to worry about it and just follow the delivery instructions he was given. The supervisor, Tom Bradley, seemed nervous and uncomfortable when James pressed for more information. James might have forgotten about the incident, but it happened again the following week. This time he was delivering computer equipment that was supposed to go to the library, but the actual destination was Vincent Torres's office building. The equipment was worth thousands of dollars, and James could not understand why it was going to a private business instead of a public facility. Being a careful man who kept good records, James started writing down the details of these unusual deliveries in a small notebook. He recorded the dates, the equipment involved, and the addresses where he was told to take city property. At first he thought there might be innocent explanations for what he was seeing, but as the weeks passed, James began to notice a pattern. Equipment that was purchased for city projects was regularly being diverted to businesses owned by contractors who worked for the city. Expensive tools, computers, and machinery were disappearing from city warehouses and ending up in private hands. James also observed that these contractors seemed to have unusually close relationships with city officials. He saw Vincent Torres and other businessmen coming and going from City Hall at all hours, often using private entrances that avoided the public areas where they might be seen by reporters or citizens. One day, James was asked to help move filing cabinets from the mayor's office to a storage facility outside the city. As he loaded the cabinets into his truck, one of them came open and papers spilled onto the ground. While picking up the documents, James could not help but notice that they contained financial records and contracts that seemed to involve the mayor's personal business dealings. James put the papers back in the cabinet and completed his delivery as instructed, but the incident troubled him. Why were the mayor's private business records being stored in city filing cabinets, and why were they being moved to a facility that was not owned by the city? That evening, James went home to his small apartment and told his wife, Carmen, about what he had been seeing at work. Carmen worked as a nurse at the public hospital and understood the importance of using public resources properly. She encouraged James to report his concerns to his supervisor or someone higher up in the city government. James tried to talk to Tom Bradley again, but his supervisor became angry and told him to mind his own business. Bradley warned James that asking too many questions could get him in trouble and suggested that he focus on doing his job instead of worrying about things that were not his responsibility. Feeling frustrated, James decided to take his concerns to the city's ethics hotline, which was supposed to allow employees to report wrongdoing anonymously. He called the number and carefully explained what he had observed, providing specific dates and details about the equipment diversions and the suspicious financial records. James waited for someone to investigate his report, but weeks passed without any response. Meanwhile, he continued to observe irregularities in his daily work. City vehicles were being used to transport materials to private construction sites. Public employees were spending time working on projects that seemed to benefit private businesses rather than city residents. Finally, James received a call from someone in the city's personnel department, asking him to come in for a meeting about his job performance. The meeting was with a woman named Lisa Chen, who told James that his supervisors had concerns about his attitude and work quality. James was shocked. He had never received negative evaluations before, and had always been considered a reliable employee. Lisa Chen showed him a file that contained several recent complaints about his work, including reports that he had been asking inappropriate questions and interfering with his colleagues' duties. James realized that his ethics complaint had not been kept confidential as promised. Instead, it had been used to target him for retaliation. He tried to explain that he was only trying to protect city resources, but Chen cut him off and warned him that any further complaints about his performance could result in disciplinary action or termination. Over the next few months, James found his work assignments becoming more difficult and unpleasant. He was given the worst shifts and the most physically demanding tasks. His requests for vacation time were denied, and he was excluded from training opportunities that could have led to promotions. Other maintenance workers began to avoid James, apparently having been told that he was a troublemaker who caused problems for the department. James felt isolated and began to worry about his job security. He had a family to support and could not afford to lose his income. Despite the pressure, James continued to document what he saw. His notebook grew thicker as he recorded more instances of city property being diverted to private use. He also began taking photographs with his phone when he could do so without being noticed. Around the same time that James was facing retaliation at work, Sarah Chen was experiencing her own problems as a freelance journalist, trying to investigate Robert Castellanos' finances. After leaving her job at the local newspaper, Sarah had continued working on the story that had gotten her reassigned. Sarah had noticed that Mayor Castellanos' lifestyle seemed inconsistent with his official salary. She had observed him driving expensive cars, wearing costly jewelry, and living in a house that appeared to be worth far more than a public official could afford on his income. Using public records requests, Sarah had tried to gather information about the mayor's financial disclosure statements and the city's contracting practices. But she encountered obstacles at every turn. Her requests for information were delayed for months, and when she finally received documents, they were heavily redacted or seemed to be missing important details. Sarah also tried to interview current and former city employees about their observations of the mayor's behavior, but most were reluctant to talk. Those who did speak with her asked that their names not be used and seemed frightened about potential consequences of being quoted in a news story. Working alone without the resources of a major newspaper, Sarah found it difficult to verify information and connect all the pieces of what appeared to be a complex web of corruption. She knew that making accusations against a popular mayor without solid proof could result in serious legal problems for her. But Sarah was persistent and skilled at investigative work. She began piecing together information from multiple sources, including court records, property transactions, and business filings. Slowly, a picture emerged of financial relationships between the mayor and various contractors that appeared to violate ethical standards and possibly criminal laws. Sarah's breakthrough came when she discovered that several of the mayor's campaign contributors had received unusually favorable treatment in city contracting processes. The same companies kept winning contracts even when their bids were not the lowest, and many of these contracts had been awarded without the competitive bidding that was required by law. She also found evidence that the mayor had business relationships with some of these contractors through consulting companies that appeared to exist only on paper. The timing of payments to these companies corresponded closely with the awarding of city contracts, suggesting a pattern of kickbacks or bribes. Working late into the night in her small apartment, Sarah began organizing this information into a comprehensive investigation that would expose the corruption at City Hall. She knew that publishing such a story would make her enemies, but she felt a responsibility to inform the public about how their tax money was being used. What Sarah did not know was that her activities had been noticed by Robert's security team. Her phone calls to city employees were being monitored, and her public records requests were being tracked by people who reported back to the mayor's office. Robert was becoming concerned about the attention his finances were receiving from journalists and city employees. He called a meeting with Maria Santos and David Park to discuss how to handle these growing threats to their operation. The three of them met in Robert's office on a Sunday evening when the building was empty. Robert was pacing nervously as he explained his concerns about James Rodriguez and Sarah Chen. "We need to shut this down before it gets out of hand," Robert said. "Rodriguez is documenting everything, and that reporter is asking too many questions. If they connect the dots, we could all go to prison." Maria suggested that they could have James transferred to a different department or even laid off as part of a budget reduction. Maria Santos sat in her office staring at the computer screen, her hands trembling as she read the email Robert had just sent her. He wanted her to delete all electronic records related to the Torres construction contracts and several other questionable deals. The email said the records were being moved to secure storage now, but Maria knew what Robert really meant. He wanted to destroy evidence. For months, Maria had been helping Robert hide his corrupt activities, telling herself that she was just following orders and that the mayor knew what was best for the city. But as Robert's demands became more extreme and dangerous, Maria began to realize that she had become part of something much worse than she had ever imagined. The request to destroy evidence was the final straw. Maria understood that obstruction of justice was a serious federal crime that could send her to prison for years. She also knew that once the records were destroyed, Robert would have even more power over her because she would be the only witness to many of his crimes. Maria had joined the city government 15 years earlier because she wanted to serve the public and make a positive difference in her community. She had grown up in the same working-class neighborhood as Robert and had initially admired his commitment to helping ordinary families. Watching him transform into a greedy and ruthless politician had been heartbreaking. But what troubled Maria most was thinking about her own daughter, Isabella, who was now a senior in high school. Isabella had always been proud of her mother's work in city government and talked about maybe becoming a public servant herself someday. How could Maria explain to her daughter that she had helped a corrupt mayor steal money from the people they were supposed to serve? That evening, Maria went home to her small house and sat at her kitchen table trying to decide what to do. She could follow Robert's orders, destroy the evidence, and hope that their crimes were never discovered. Or she could find the courage to do what she knew was right, even though it might destroy her career and put her family at risk. Maria thought about James Rodriguez, the maintenance worker who had tried to report irregularities and had been punished for his honesty. She thought about the taxpayers who trusted their elected officials to use public money responsibly. She thought about her daughter and the kind of world she wanted to leave for the next generation. The next morning, Maria called in sick to work and drove to the public library in a neighboring town. Using a computer that could not be traced back to her, she researched federal whistleblower laws and contacted information about how to report government corruption to the FBI. Maria learned that federal law protected employees who reported criminal activity by their supervisors, but she also understood that retaliation was common and that her life would become very difficult once she came forward. She would need a good lawyer and solid evidence to make her case credible. Over the next several days, Maria began secretly copying documents and electronic files that proved Robert's corrupt activities. She stayed late at the office, claiming to be catching up on work, while she systematically gathered evidence of bribes, kickbacks, fraudulent contracts, and money laundering. The evidence was extensive and damning. Maria had helped create much of it herself, so she knew exactly where to find the most incriminating documents. She copied financial records showing payments from contractors to Robert's shell companies. She saved emails discussing illegal deals. She even found recordings of conversations that Robert had made for his own protection, but had forgotten about. Maria was careful to avoid detection while gathering this evidence. She used flash drives that she hid in her purse and copied files in small batches over several weeks. She also began keeping detailed notes about conversations she had witnessed and crimes she had helped facilitate. The hardest part was continuing to act normal around Robert and David Park, while she was secretly building a case against them. Maria had to attend meetings where they discussed their criminal activities and respond to Robert's instructions as if she was still a loyal member of his team. Robert seemed to sense that something was different about Maria, but he attributed her nervousness to stress about the risks they were all taking. He tried to reassure her by promising that their operation was too well protected to be exposed and that they would all be wealthy enough to retire comfortably within a few years. These conversations only strengthened Maria's resolve to bring Robert down. She could see that he had no intention of stopping his criminal activities and that he would continue stealing from the public until he was forced to stop. After 3 weeks of gathering evidence, Maria felt ready to contact the authorities. But she knew that going to local law enforcement would be dangerous because Robert had cultivated relationships with police officials and could learn about her cooperation before federal agents had a chance to protect her. Instead, Maria hired a criminal defense attorney named Rebecca Martinez, who specialized in representing government whistleblowers. Rebecca had a good reputation and had successfully protected other clients who had exposed corruption in public agencies. During their first meeting, Rebecca explained the legal process and the personal risks that Maria would face. She warned that Robert would almost certainly retaliate against Maria once her cooperation became known, and that the investigation could take months or years to complete. Rebecca also explained that as a participant in the corruption, Maria herself could face criminal charges. However, her cooperation with federal investigators would likely result in immunity or a very light sentence, especially since she was coming forward voluntarily and providing evidence against the leaders of the scheme. With Rebecca's help, Maria contacted the FBI office that handled public corruption cases. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh was assigned to review Maria's evidence and determine whether it justified opening a formal investigation. Agent Walsh was a 15-year veteran of the FBI who had investigated dozens of corruption cases involving politicians, contractors, and organized crime figures. She was impressed by the quality and quantity of evidence that Maria had gathered, calling it some of the best documentation she had ever seen in a corruption case. The evidence clearly showed a pattern of bribery, fraud, and money laundering that had been going on for several years and involved millions of dollars in public funds. Agent Walsh believed there was more than enough evidence to obtain search warrants and criminal indictments against Robert and his co-conspirators, but Agent Walsh also wanted to gather additional evidence while the investigation was still secret. She asked Maria to continue working normally and to cooperate in recording conversations with Robert and David Park. This would provide even stronger evidence and help investigators understand the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Maria agreed to wear a recording device during meetings with Robert, even though doing so made her extremely nervous. She was terrified that Robert would discover the device and realize that she was cooperating with federal investigators. Over the next month, Maria recorded dozens of conversations in which Robert discussed bribes, kickbacks, and plans to destroy evidence. The recordings captured Robert's voice clearly as he gave explicit instructions about illegal activities and talked casually about stealing public money. The most damaging recording came when Robert told Maria to transfer money from a city account to one of his shell companies to pay for his daughter's private school tuition. This conversation provided clear evidence that Robert was directly stealing taxpayer funds for personal use. During this same period, Sarah Chen had finally gathered enough evidence to publish her investigative series about corruption in city government. Working with a national magazine that had the resources to fact-check her work and defend against potential lawsuits, Sarah was preparing to expose Robert's crimes to the public. Sarah's investigation had uncovered many of the same financial irregularities that Maria was documenting for the FBI. The journalist's work would provide important confirmation of the federal case and would help ensure that the public understood the full extent of Robert's betrayal of their trust. James Rodriguez had also continued documenting the misuse of city equipment and resources, despite the retaliation he faced at work. His detailed records would prove valuable in showing how Robert's corruption affected every aspect of city operations. All of these separate efforts were converging toward the same goal: exposing Robert Castellanos' crimes and holding him accountable for betraying the public trust. The mayor, who had once promised to be a voice for working families, was about to discover that some of those families would not stay silent while he robbed them. Agent Walsh and her team were finalizing their investigation and preparing to execute search warrants that would seize Robert's records and freeze his financial accounts. Federal prosecutors were reviewing the evidence and preparing criminal charges that could send Robert to prison for decades. Maria knew that her life was about to change forever. Once the FBI raids began, Robert would know that she had betrayed him, and she would never be able to work in city government again. But she felt at peace with her decision because she knew she was doing the right thing for her community and her daughter. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning in October when Robert Castellanos' world came crashing down. He was sitting in his office reviewing plans for a new waterfront development project that would bring him another substantial kickback when his secretary buzzed him on the intercom. "Mr. Mayor, there are some federal agents here to see you," she said, her voice shaking with nervousness. Robert felt his stomach drop, but he tried to remain calm. He had always known this day might come, and he had prepared for it. His lawyers had coached him on what to say and what not to say if he was ever questioned by federal agents. "Send them in," Robert said, straightening his tie and putting on his most confident smile. 3 FBI agents entered his office, led by Special Agent Jennifer Walsh. She was carrying a thick folder and had the serious expression of someone who was about to deliver very bad news. "Mayor Castellano, I'm Agent Walsh with the FBI. We have a federal search warrant for your office, your home, and your financial records. You are not under arrest at this time, but I need to advise you that you are the subject of a federal investigation into public corruption." Robert's hands began to shake as Agent Walsh handed him a copy of the search warrant. The document was several pages long and listed dozens of items that the FBI was authorized to seize, including computers, financial records, cell phones, and any documents related to city contracts or his consulting businesses. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," Robert said, his voice cracking slightly. "I haven't done anything wrong. I've always followed the law and served the people of this city to the best of my ability." Agent Walsh did not respond to Robert's protests. She simply nodded to the other agents, who began systematically searching his office and removing items that were listed in the warrant. They unplugged his computer and carried it away in an evidence bag. They opened his filing cabinets and began removing documents by the box full. Robert watched helplessly as years of carefully hidden evidence was gathered up and taken away. He knew that the agents would find incriminating documents, but he hoped that his lawyers would be able to keep the most damaging material from being used against him in courting. What Robert did not know was that similar raids were happening simultaneously at a dozen other locations around the city. FBI agents were searching his house, his shell company offices, Vincent Torres's construction headquarters, and the homes of David Park and several other co-conspirators. The raids had been carefully coordinated to prevent any of the suspects from warning each other or destroying evidence. Phone lines were monitored, and agents were stationed at all possible escape routes to make sure that no one fled the city before they could be arrested. At City Hall, word of the FBI raid spread quickly through the building. City employees gathered in small groups, whispering about what they had seen and speculating about what it all meant. Many had suspected that something inappropriate was happening in the mayor's office, but few had imagined that federal agents would ever get involved. Maria Santos was at her desk when the agents arrived, pretending to work on routine paperwork while secretly watching the raid unfold. She felt a mixture of relief and terror as she saw boxes of evidence being carried out of Robert's office. She was relieved that her cooperation with the FBI was finally bearing fruit, but she was terrified about how Robert would react when he discovered her betrayal. Agent Walsh had told Maria to act normally and not to do anything that might reveal her role as the key witness in the case. Maria tried to look surprised and concerned like her colleagues, but she was afraid that her nervousness would give her away. Around noon, Robert emerged from his office looking pale and shaken. The FBI agents had finished their search and were loading the evidence into unmarked vans outside City Hall. Local news crews had gathered on the street, having been tipped off about the raids by sources within law enforcement. Robert tried to slip out of the building through a side entrance, but reporters were waiting for him there too. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust in his face as he walked quickly toward his car. "Mayor Castellano, can you comment on the FBI raid of your office?" shouted one reporter. "Are you planning to resign?" called another. "What do you say to citizens who trusted you with their tax money?" asked a third. Robert kept walking without answering any questions. He got into his car and drove away, leaving behind a crowd of reporters and a building full of shocked city employees. At the same time, Sarah Chen was putting the finishing touches on her investigative series about Robert's corruption. She had been working with her editors for weeks to verify every detail and prepare for the legal challenges that would inevitably follow publication. Sarah's series would be published online that evening, just hours after the FBI raids. The timing was perfect because the raids would confirm many of the allegations in her reporting and would show readers that law enforcement was taking the corruption seriously. The first article in Sarah's series was titled "The Mayor's Secret Fortune: How Robert Castellano Turned Public Service into Private Profit." The piece detailed Robert's luxurious lifestyle, his shell companies, and his suspicious relationships with contractors who received favorable treatment from the city. Sarah had charts and graphs showing how much money had flowed from city contracts to Robert's personal accounts. She had photographs of his mansion, his boat, and his expensive cars. She had quotes from city employees who described the culture of fear and corruption that Robert had created. The response to Sarah's articles was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of publication, the stories had been shared thousands of times on social media. Citizens who had long suspected that something was wrong finally had confirmation of their suspicions. Phone calls flooded into City Hall demanding Robert's resignation. The City Council called an emergency meeting to discuss the crisis. Community groups organized protests calling for accountability and reform. Robert spent that evening at his mansion, meeting with his team of expensive lawyers and trying to figure out how to respond to the catastrophe that had befallen him. The attorneys told him that the federal charges he was facing could result in decades in prison if he was convicted. The lawyers also warned Robert that the FBI investigation was far from over. The agents had seized enough evidence to keep prosecutors busy for months, and they would likely be seeking cooperation from other members of Robert's criminal network. "They're going to pressure your associates to testify against you," one lawyer explained. "They'll offer reduced sentences or immunity in exchange for cooperation. You need to be prepared for the possibility that people you trusted will turn against you to save themselves." Robert felt sick as he realized how many people knew about his crimes and could potentially testify against him. Maria Santos knew everything because she had helped facilitate most of his corrupt deals. David Park had detailed knowledge of the financial schemes. Even Vincent Torres might decide to cooperate if he faced serious prison time. The next morning brought more bad news. The local newspaper, which had supported Robert for years, published a scathing editorial calling for his immediate resignation. The editorial board wrote that they felt betrayed by Robert's deception and apologized to readers for not investigating his activities more thoroughly. The city council held its emergency meeting that afternoon, with hundreds of angry citizens packed into the council chambers and overflow crowds watching on television. One by one, council members stood up to denounce Robert's alleged crimes and call for his resignation. Several council members admitted that they had suspected inappropriate activity but had been afraid to speak out because of Robert's reputation for retaliation. They apologized to voters for not doing more to protect the city's integrity. The most emotional moment came when Elena Vasquez, the elderly woman whose grandson Robert had helped years earlier, stood up to address the council. She was now in her 80s and walked slowly to the microphone with the help of a cane. "I trusted Robert Castellano," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "When my grandson was hurt, Robert promised to help us get justice. He kept that promise, and I thought he was a good man who cared about people like me." Elena paused and wiped tears from her eyes before continuing. "But now I see that he was stealing money from all of us while he pretended to care. He stole money that could have helped other families like mine. He betrayed all of us who believed in him." Elena's words captured the feelings of betrayal and anger that were sweeping through the community. Citizens who had once admired Robert now felt foolish for trusting him. They realized that while they had been struggling to pay their bills and support their families, their mayor had been getting rich by stealing their tax money. By the end of the week, Robert's political support had completely collapsed. Every major organization in the city had called for his resignation. His own staff was abandoning him, with several key aides announcing that they were looking for other jobs. But Robert refused to resign. His lawyers had advised him that resigning might be seen as an admission of guilt that could be used against him in his criminal trial. Instead, he hunkered down in his mansion and tried to wait out the storm. This decision only made things worse for Robert. The arrest came on a cold morning in November, 6 weeks after the FBI raids that had started Robert Castellano's downfall. Federal agents arrived at his mansion before dawn, carrying handcuffs and an arrest warrant that charged him with 17 felony counts including bribery, money laundering, conspiracy, and fraud. Robert had been expecting this moment, but it still felt surreal as Agent Walsh read him his rights and placed him under arrest. His wife Linda watched from the doorway in her bathrobe, tears streaming down her face. Their 2 young children were still asleep upstairs, unaware that their father was being taken away in handcuffs. "Robert Castellano, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit bribery, money laundering, and defrauding the citizens of this city," Agent Walsh said as she secured the handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Robert was led to the waiting police car, neighbors came out of their houses to watch. Some of them had been his friends for years, but now they looked at him with disgust and disappointment. The man who had once been their respected mayor was now just another criminal being taken to jail. The booking process at the federal detention center was humiliating for Robert. His expensive suit was taken away and replaced with an orange jumpsuit. His fingerprints and photograph were taken for official records. He was placed in a small cell with a metal toilet and a thin mattress, a far cry from the luxury he had become accustomed to. Robert's lawyers worked quickly to arrange bail, but the federal judge was not sympathetic. Given the serious nature of the charges and Robert's access to hidden financial accounts, the judge considered him a flight risk. Bail was set at $5 million, with strict conditions that included surrendering his passport and agreeing to electronic monitoring. It took 3 days for Robert's family to raise the bail money by selling property and borrowing against their remaining assets. When Robert finally returned home, he found that his life had completely changed. Reporters camped outside his house. His phone rang constantly with angry calls from former supporters, and his children were being harassed at school by classmates who had heard about their father's crimes. Linda was struggling to cope with the shame and stress of being married to an accused criminal. She had filed for divorce and was planning to move back to her parents' house with the children. The comfortable life she had enjoyed as the mayor's wife was over, replaced by uncertainty and embarrassment. "I don't even know who you are anymore," Linda told Robert as she packed her belongings. "The man I married cared about helping people, not stealing from them. I can't be part of this anymore." Robert begged Linda to stay and work through their problems together, but she was determined to protect herself and their children from further damage. She had already hired her own lawyer and was cooperating with federal investigators to show that she had no knowledge of Robert's criminal activities. The criminal trial began 8 months later, in a federal courthouse packed with media representatives and curious citizens. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, an experienced prosecutor who specialized in public corruption cases. Rodriguez's opening statement painted a clear picture of Robert's transformation from an idealistic public servant into a greedy criminal who had betrayed the trust of everyone who supported him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the corruption of power and the betrayal of public trust," Rodriguez said. The defendant, Robert Castellano, took an oath to serve the people of this city. Instead, he served himself. He turned city government into his personal piggy bank and stole millions of dollars that belonged to the taxpayers. Rodriguez outlined the evidence that prosecutors would present, including financial records showing bribes and kickbacks, recorded conversations in which Robert discussed his crimes, and testimony from co-conspirators who had agreed to cooperate with the government. Robert's defense team, led by expensive attorney Margaret Sullivan, argued that their client was a dedicated public servant who had been set up by vindictive business partners and disgruntled employees. They claimed that Robert had made some poor decisions, but had never intentionally committed crimes. Robert Castellano devoted his life to public service, Sullivan told the jury. He came from a working-class family and genuinely cared about helping his community. Yes, he made mistakes in judgment, but he is not the criminal mastermind that the government wants you to believe he is. But the evidence against Robert was overwhelming. The prosecution's star witness was Maria Santos, who testified for 3 days about her role in helping Robert hide his corrupt activities. Maria's testimony was devastating because she had been present for most of Robert's crimes and had kept detailed records of everything that happened. Maria described how Robert had gradually drawn her into his criminal scheme, starting with small favors and eventually demanding that she help him launder money and destroy evidence. She testified about specific conversations in which Robert had discussed bribes and kickbacks, and she identified dozens of documents that proved his guilt. "I helped him because I was scared and because I thought I was protecting my job," Maria said, crying as she testified. "But I knew what we were doing was wrong. We were stealing money from people who trusted us to serve them honestly." The prosecution also played recordings that Maria had made while cooperating with the FBI. In these recordings, Robert's voice could be clearly heard discussing illegal activities and giving instructions about how to hide evidence of his crimes. Vincent Torres also testified against Robert, describing how their corrupt relationship had developed over several years. Torres admitted that he had paid Robert hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes disguised as consulting fees, and that Robert had steered millions of dollars in city contracts to Torres Construction in return. Robert made it clear that if I wanted to do business with the city, I had to pay him personally, Torres testified. It wasn't optional. It was the price of getting contracts. David Park testified about the financial schemes he had helped Robert create, including the shell companies and offshore accounts that were used to hide bribe money. Park's detailed knowledge of Robert's finances provided prosecutors with a clear picture of how much money Robert had stolen and where it had gone. James Rodriguez also testified, describing how he had observed city equipment and resources being diverted to Robert's personal use and to businesses that were paying bribes. His careful documentation had provided important evidence that corroborated the testimony of other witnesses. Sarah Chen testified about her investigation into Robert's finances and the obstacles she had encountered when trying to obtain public records. Her testimony showed how Robert had used his power to obstruct legitimate journalistic inquiries and hide information from the public. The most emotional testimony came from ordinary citizens who described how Robert's corruption had affected their lives. They talked about programs that had been cut while Robert was getting rich, infrastructure projects that had been delayed while money was diverted to his personal accounts, and their feelings of betrayal when they learned how he had deceived them. Elena Vasquez, now 84 years old, testified about how Robert had helped her family years earlier, but had ultimately betrayed the trust she had placed in him. Her testimony reminded the jury that Robert's crimes were not victimless. They had real consequences for real people. Robert's lawyers tried to discredit the witnesses by suggesting that they were lying to get reduced sentences or to cover up their own crimes, but the evidence was too strong and came from too many different sources to be dismissed. The defense also tried to argue that Robert's actions, while inappropriate, did not rise to the level of criminal activity. They claimed that the consulting payments were legitimate business transactions and that Robert had not intentionally violated any laws. But prosecutors showed that Robert had gone to great lengths to hide his activities, including creating fake companies, using offshore accounts, and instructing subordinates to destroy evidence. These actions demonstrated a clear intent to deceive and defraud. After 6 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury. It took them only 2 days to reach a verdict. Robert was found guilty on all 17 counts, including the most serious charges of bribery and money laundering. As the verdict was read, Robert sat quietly at the defense table, his face showing no emotion. But inside, he felt his world completely collapsing. The guilty verdict meant that he would almost certainly spend many years in federal prison. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later. Prosecutors asked for a sentence of 25 years in prison, arguing that Robert's crimes had damaged public trust and stolen millions of dollars from taxpayers. They also requested that Robert be ordered to pay full restitution to the city. Defense attorneys asked for a lighter sentence, arguing that Robert had already lost everything and had learned from his mistakes. They presented letters from family members and former supporters asking the judge to show mercy. But federal judge Patricia Williams was not inclined to be lenient. In imposing sentence, she spoke directly to Robert about the seriousness of his crimes and their impact on the community.